Have you ever stopped to think about how an apparently innocent decision can change your entire life? Well, what seemed like a simple hunting trip ended up turning into a crossroads of choices that no one could have predicted. And it all started with a simple jar of peanut butter. Now, imagine yourself in Mark's shoes, a devoted husband who, through a series of small coincidences, gets involved in a situation that challenges everything he believed about his marriage and himself. The unexpected attraction, the confusing feelings, and the temptation that seemed impossible to resist. Have you ever experienced something like this? Stay with me, because this story is not just about infidelity or betrayal. It's about the choices we all make and the consequences they bring. But before we continue, if you're not subscribed yet, don't waste any more time. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you won't miss any detail of this story that will blow your mind. Mark was the kind of devoted husband, always trying to please his wife, Lisa. When she suggested he go on a hunting trip, something he normally did alone, he didn't think twice. The idea of being alone in nature seemed perfect, but Lisa had other plans. Convincing him to bring Chloe, her younger, recently divorced co-worker, Lisa justified the need for Chloe's company due to health reasons. Although Mark was reluctant, the pressure was enough to make him give in and invite her on the trip. Chloe wasn't exactly the company Mark had expected. A woman full of energy and curiosity, she was more interested in learning about hunting than anything related to the peacefulness of the countryside. For her, the trip represented a chance to escape a difficult recent past, but for Mark, it brought a sense of discomfort. He knew it would be challenging to have company during a time that had always been synonymous with peace and introspection. But he was determined not to let this affect the trip and went with the flow. As the weekend approached, Mark had no idea what awaited him. The setup of the trip seemed simple: hunting, relaxation, and time away from the routine. But something was brewing on the horizon. He just didn't know yet how Chloe, with her vibrant presence and contagious energy, would change everything. As the car drove along the road to the secluded cabin, Mark felt a mix of apprehension and uncertainty, unaware that his life, at that very moment, was about to take an unexpected turn. Lisa knew how much Mark loved his solitude, but she insisted that Chloe come along. The reason, of course, was Chloe's health, as she had recently gone through a divorce and needed support to get over this painful chapter of her life. Lisa believed that the hunting trip could be an opportunity for a fresh start, a new beginning for the young woman. Mark, on the other hand, was not convinced at all. He imagined that he would have to deal with the challenge of sharing his escape with someone he barely knew, which seemed like an unlikely mix. Chloe was a difficult person to describe. With her vibrant energy and enthusiasm for everything around her, she seemed to live in a constant state of excitement. She had just gone through a painful divorce, and hunting represented, for her, a way to reconnect with herself and with nature. Mark didn't know what to expect from someone so young and with such an open personality. He was more reserved, the kind of person who steered clear of any situation that made him feel vulnerable or out of control. Even so, Lisa was right about one thing: Chloe needed a distraction and to feel alive again. For her, time with Mark in the cabin seemed like a way to forget the difficulties of life. Mark, however, was skeptical about how this could work. He thought the trip should be about rest and solitude, not about serving as a refuge for someone else. Little did he know that this forced companionship would bring more challenges than he could have imagined. Upon arriving at the secluded cabin, Mark felt the familiarity of the place, but something was different. Chloe, with her free and uninhibited nature, seemed right at home there, more comfortable than he ever imagined. As she entered the cabin, she went straight to the bathroom and within minutes emerged wrapped in a towel, her hair still wet. Mark didn't know where to look. She moved with a freedom he hadn't expected, and the physical proximity, even without explicit intentions, began to create a tension in the air. Chloe, unaware of the intensity of Mark's discomfort, seemed completely at ease. She laughed, chatted, and even joked about how he seemed like a veteran hunter, as if they were just on any regular weekend getaway. But for Mark, the tension was growing. He tried to focus on the landscape, on the hunts that were coming, but Chloe's presence felt like an invisible weight, something he couldn't ignore. Every movement she made seemed to have an effect, and what had once been a peaceful trip was quickly turning into a game of silent provocations. However, Mark knew he needed to maintain his composure. After all, he was there to hunt, not to get lost in uncomfortable thoughts about his growing attraction to Chloe. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself that everything was fine, something inside him knew that this trip would bring unexpected consequences. And that growing tension between them was just the first sign that the coming days might be much more complicated than he had imagined. The situation in the cabin was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Mark. While he tried to keep his distance, Chloe, with her irreverent nature, continued testing the limits of his patience. At one point, she appeared with an empty jar of peanut butter, playing with it as if it were an innocent object. She used it as an excuse to get closer, making jokes about how serious he was and that he should relax a bit. Mark tried to stay focused on his mission of hunting, but Chloe was constantly interrupting his thoughts, creating an unrest that he couldn't control. The way Chloe looked at him was also loaded with meaning. Her eyes were attentive, not just to what he was saying, but also to his behavior. Every gesture of hers seemed to calculate his reaction, and Mark felt the pressure to maintain a facade of indifference. However, inside, he was struggling with his own feelings. He knew something was forming there, something that shouldn't happen but was impossible to ignore. The peanut butter jar, seemingly a joke, was just a disguise for something deeper, a veiled provocation he still couldn't fully understand. As the night went on, Mark found himself more and more absorbed by Chloe's presence. She seemed to be on a silent mission to test his limits, making him question not only his own desires, but also his fidelity. He knew he was being pulled by something beyond the obvious, but he was reluctant to admit to himself what it meant. The tension in the air was building like a storm about to explode, and with every word and every glance, the hunting trip was becoming more of an emotional battlefield than a relaxing escape. The next morning, Mark already knew the weekend had changed forever. As he was having his coffee, he heard light footsteps coming down the stairs of the cabin. When he looked up, Chloe was there, completely naked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mark froze, his eyes not knowing where to focus, his mind trying to process what was happening. She moved with an unsettling confidence, as if there was nothing wrong with her behavior. To him, however, it represented a point of no return. His attempt to maintain distance and control had gone out the window. Chloe seemed completely unaware of how her presence was affecting Mark. She acted as if it were a casual thing, an expression of freedom. Mark, on the other hand, could no longer maintain his composure. His mind, which had been focused on staying distant, started to break down, and his feelings became a confusing mix of attraction and guilt. He knew what was happening was more than just simple curiosity. It was a rupture in the boundaries he had always imposed on himself, a line he shouldn't cross. Although Mark tried to rationalize the situation, Chloe's words were like an enticing beacon that he couldn't look away from. She seemed to have no inhibitions, no concern for the consequences, which only made Mark's attraction to her grow even more. He felt like he was sinking into dangerous territory, but at the same time, something inside him was pushing him forward. The breaking point wasn't just a physical moment. It was the breaking of something much deeper inside him. Something that couldn't be ignored any longer. When Mark and Chloe set off into the forest, something inside Mark already knew that hunting was no longer the main focus. He tried to convince himself that he was still there to hunt, to be the man he always was, but Chloe's presence made every step harder. The silence in the forest, which would normally be a peaceful refuge for him, now seemed to carry a palpable tension. The glances they exchanged, the subtle smiles, everything was becoming more laden with meaning. Mark tried to ignore it, but he knew he couldn't escape the situation anymore. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed to be savoring every moment. She was there, in nature, with the same vibrant energy she always had, but now, with a slight provocation in every gesture. When she looked at him, it wasn't just an exchange of glances, it was something more, something Mark didn't know how to handle. Every word she said, every movement, seemed aimed at testing him, pushing things further. Mark, no matter how hard he tried to resist, could no longer deny the attraction he felt for her. The hunt, which was supposed to be an isolated and quiet experience, was turning into an emotional minefield. The most unsettling thing for Mark was that he didn't know how to turn back. He had imagined that this weekend would be about hunting deer, maybe sharing some stories with a friend. But now, he was immersed in a situation where the rules had already changed. What was happening between him and Chloe was more complex than any hunt he had ever been on. It was something emotional, something that, deep down, he knew would change everything. And this internal conflict was growing with every step he took. When Mark and Chloe reached the small hunting hideout in the forest, the atmosphere was dense, filled with silent tension. The place, designed to be a refuge where calm would settle, now felt different. Mark tried to focus on the firearms safety instructions, but Chloe's presence beside him was becoming harder to ignore. She listened attentively, but her eyes weren't just on the guns. They wandered to Mark, as if expecting something more. The tension in the air was almost tangible, like electricity about to manifest. While Mark tried to stay focused on the hunts and what he was supposed to be doing, Chloe seemed to relax, completely at ease. She wasn't just absorbing the instructions. She was absorbing Mark as well. Their knowing glances and subtle smiles spoke more than any words could. Mark, no matter how much he tried to maintain composure, felt his mind wandering. He knew the hunt was no longer his main concern. What really mattered now was his interaction with Chloe. And there was no turning back. He was at a point of no return, where the line between professional and personal was becoming blurred. Mark forced himself to focus on the surrounding forest, trying to erase the thoughts that kept surfacing in his mind. But it was impossible not to notice how Chloe moved beside him, how she got closer than necessary. He wondered if she was aware of this, or if, in fact, she was just being who she was, spontaneous, provocative, and unafraid to break the barriers between them. The hideout, which should have been a peaceful place for hunting, had now become an emotional battlefield, where the true hunt seemed to be more about controlling desire than anything else. The tension in the hunting cabin reached its peak when Chloe tried to shoot a deer that appeared on the trail. She lined up the rifle, aimed with precision, but when she pulled the trigger, she realized the rifle was unloaded. Frustration was visible on her face, and she didn't hesitate to express her disappointment aloud. Mark, in turn, tried to hide his own frustration, but the situation only worsened. The atmosphere in the cabin became dense, and the energy that had been provocative was now filled with discouragement. The hunt had lost its significance, and all Mark could feel was a growing irritation, not at Chloe's mistake, but at the feeling of being increasingly detached from his own control. Chloe, however, handled the mistake with surprising ease. Without warning, she took off her jacket, tossing it aside due to the increasing heat in the forest. Mark couldn't help but observe every movement, every detail of her presence. She was completely at ease, as if there was nothing more important to do. For her, the shooting mistake seemed to be nothing more than an opportunity to relax, but for Mark, it was yet another boundary being broken, another reminder of how everything was becoming harder to control. His mind was far from the hunt, focused on something much more visceral, much more complicated. The tension between them didn't dissipate. On the contrary, it intensified with every gesture Chloe made. Her carefree behavior only made Mark question his own composure. He wanted to stay focused on the hunt, to remain distant from the situation, but the atmosphere inside the cabin said otherwise. He knew the attraction between them was undeniable, but he also knew that every step closer to giving into it was a step farther from his own morals. Each exchanged look and every movement from Chloe made the dilemma inside Mark harder to face. What had seemed like a simple hunting trip had turned into something far more complex and risky. As Chloe began to remove more layers of clothing, Mark could no longer ignore the growing tension between them. The heat of the forest, which had already taken over the environment, seemed to amplify the proximity between them. Each piece of clothing she left behind was like one more step towards something Mark didn't know how to control. She seemed to be playing with the situation, as if she knew exactly the effect she had on him, challenging his self-control every second. And Mark, despite his attempts to remain calm, could no longer deny what was happening. Chloe, with her laid-back attitude, subtly yet effectively challenged Mark. Each lingering look, each smile more loaded with meanings he wasn't ready to decipher. She seemed to sense his internal struggle, and that only intensified the unspoken desire between them. Mark knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he couldn't walk away. The feeling of attraction was too strong, and the internal conflict made everything more intense. What had seemed like a simple hunting trip was now turning into an emotional minefield, where he was battling not only what he knew was wrong, but also what he felt. Chloe's gazes were more than just flirtations. They were a silent invitation, a psychological game that Mark knew he could no longer ignore. The hunt, which should have been the center of his attention, had become a distraction. He found himself more and more focused on Chloe, her actions, her presence. The tension between them was palpable, and Mark knew he was about to cross a line from which he couldn't come back. What would happen next was uncertain, but the line between desire and guilt was becoming increasingly thin. The turning point came when Chloe, with a mischievous smile, acknowledged the tension hanging between her and Mark. With a decisive movement, she placed her hand on his arm, as if there was nothing left to lose. Mark initially resisted, trying to maintain control over his emotions and his body, but the sensation of her skin touching his was a trigger that sparked something deep inside him. The internal battle he had been fighting dissolved in an instant, and all that was left was desire. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same, but somehow, it felt inevitable. He was so immersed in the situation that there was no room for regret. The attraction between them exploded into a passionate and urgent kiss. No more words, no more worries. What had seemed like just a hunting trip was now beyond rationality, beyond control. The guilt Mark had initially felt dissolved in the heat of the moment, as if the connection between them was the only thing that mattered. He felt alive, more than ever, and for an instant, the reality outside his body seemed to disappear. The desire he had tried to ignore became an undeniable fact, and the line between right and wrong blurred. After the kiss, both were silent, as if the gravity of what had just happened hadn't yet settled. The tension between them hadn't lessened. On the contrary, it seemed to grow. Mark, now aware of what had transpired, wondered what to do next. What had once seemed like a simple judgment error had now become a crossroads. They were on the edge of something they could no longer turn back from, and Mark knew that once that line was crossed, the consequences would be inevitable. As they walked back to the cabin, Mark was immersed in conflicting thoughts, struggling to process what had just happened. Guilt was beginning to seep in, but there was something else, something he couldn't explain. He felt a connection with Chloe, an intensity he hadn't felt in years. His relationship with his wife, Lisa, was beginning to seem distant and lifeless, and he wondered if what had happened with Chloe was a reflection of something he had felt for a long time. He knew he had crossed a line, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't deny how alive the moment had made him feel. The connection that had arisen so unexpectedly seemed to have brought a new perspective to his life. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed as calm as ever, as if what had happened wasn't a major dilemma for her. She acknowledged the emotional weight of what was at stake, but she didn't seem willing to abandon what had just begun. The look she exchanged with Mark was laden with a silent complexity. They both knew their lives had changed, but neither seemed ready to deal with it definitively. Guilt wasn't enough to erase what they had shared, and as they made their way back to the cabin, the sense of inevitability filled the air. The passion between them was undeniable, but the impact on their personal lives was a burden neither of them wanted to carry. Mark felt the weight of guilt growing heavier as the minutes passed. He knew he had a marriage to save, a wife who, until that moment, had trusted him. However, the connection with Chloe was undeniable. Something in her had sparked a flame in him he thought had long been extinguished. But as the aftermath of the situation settled over him, Mark began to question, how far was he willing to go for this connection? And what would happen to his life, his family, if he decided to move forward with something that, at first, seemed like a simple temptation? Sitting near the fire, Mark and Chloe finally put a name to what they had created. The tension was still there, heavy and palpable, but the words they exchanged brought a certain relief, as if by talking about what had happened, they could finally understand. Mark, with his heavy conscience, insisted that it couldn't happen again, as if by setting this boundary, he could reset the situation and go back to how things were before. But Chloe, with an unsettling sincerity, said that, although she knew what they had done was wrong, there was something she felt had been missing in her life for a long time. This confession, so honest and raw, took Mark by surprise, and he didn't know how to respond. Chloe's words echoed in his mind, leaving him more confused than ever. For Mark, reality was harsh and unforgiving. He knew his wife was at home, waiting for him, and that the consequences of what he had done with Chloe could be devastating for his family. But on the other hand, there was something about Chloe that made him question everything he thought he knew about his marriage and himself. She had touched something inside him that Lisa, his wife, could no longer reach. Mark found himself faced with a moral and emotional dilemma: to continue in his safe life, but without passion, or risk everything for an uncertain connection full of complications. There were no easy answers, and as the fire in the fireplace died down, the questions that haunted him remained unanswered. Chloe, for her part, seemed calmer, more certain of what she wanted. She knew what had happened, knew what she felt, but didn't seem regretful. For her, what had occurred between them wasn't just an impulsive mistake, but a lost opportunity over the years. Unlike Mark, who found himself tangled in a web of guilt and uncertainty, Chloe seemed to have accepted the reality that things don't always go the right way, but that didn't mean they weren't valid. Mark knew deep down that there was much more to the situation than simple attraction. But what he would do with it, and how it would change his future, he still didn't know. Now that you've followed every step of this story and seen how choices can transform lives in ways we never imagined, the big question is, what would you do in Mark's place? Would you stay in your comfort zone, risking losing something that could be the key to your happiness? Or would you allow yourself to explore the unknown, even with all the consequences? Life is made of choices, and each one leads us to a unique destiny, full of possibilities and also challenges. Don't let doubt or the fear of the unknown stop you from taking control of your own life. Now it's your turn to reflect. How can you apply what you've learned here to avoid falling into the traps that come from momentary decisions and choices? If you're ready to continue learning more about infidelity, betrayal, and how to deal with these complex situations, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the chance to dive deeper into what really matters.